Welcome back to the Otherworldly Podcast. I am your host, Frank. Our co-host, Dylan, will not be joining us today. He had a misfortunate accident. Today we have a few stories for you to listen to help spook up your night, make sure the lights are off, and get ready to listen to this horrid voice all night. I hope you enjoy. My grandmother grew up in the slums of Prohibition-era Chicago. Her family lived in a small house near the harbor, and one of her earliest memories was of a particularly hot summer when, seeking respite from the heat, she and her sister discovered a seldom-used section of the boardwalk near an abandoned warehouse. Every night for several weeks, the two girls would make their way down to the docks and sit together on the edge of the pier as the sun went down. My grandmother vividly and for some time fondly recalled the feel of seaweed between her toes as she and her sister dangled their feet into the murky water. It wasn't until years later she returned to the pier and found that the warehouse had been demolished. Curiously, she made an inquiry with the Department of Planning and Development. Apparently, the warehouse had been owned for a time by the mob, who was using it as a base of operations for a local prostitution racket. It had only been discovered when an associate began disposing of rival hookers by fitting them with concrete shoes and dumping them into the harbor. Investigating officers recovered nearly 24 bodies from the waters of a secluded pier nearby. How had the bodies been discovered? A passing fisherman spotted some of the victim's hair floating near the surface of the water, like seaweed. He awoke to the large insect-like creatures looming over his bed and screamed his lungs out. They hastily left the room, and he stayed up all night, shaking, wondering if it had been a dream. The next morning, there was a tap on the door. Gathering his courage, he opened it to see one of them gently placing a plate with fried breakfast on the floor, then retreat to a safe distance. Bewildered, he accepted the gift. The creatures chatted excitingly. This happened every day for a few weeks. At first, he worried they were fattening him up, but after a particularly greasy breakfast left him clutching his chest from heartburn, they were replaced with fresh fruit. As well as cooking, they poured hot, steamy baths for him and even tucked him in when he went to bed. It was bizarre. One night, he awoke to gunshots and screaming. He raced downstairs to find a decapitated burglar being devoured by the insects. He was sickened, but disposed of their remains the best he could. He knew they had just been protecting him. One morning, the creatures wouldn't let him leave his room. He lay down, confused but trusting, as they ushered him back to bed. Whatever their motives, they weren't going to hurt him. Hours later, a burning pain spread throughout his body. It felt like his stomach was filled with razor wire. The insects chattered as he spasmed and moaned. It was only when he felt a terrible squirming beneath his skin that he realized the insects hadn't been protecting him. They had been protecting their young. My grandfather died last year, when my son was about a year old. We had dinner with the whole family every Friday night, so my son had seen him several times. My grandfather was a very quiet and proud man, but when he thought no one was looking, or when he was alone, he would make silly faces at my son to get him to laugh. A couple of nights after the funeral, my son, who liked to crawl in bed with us in the middle of the night, began laughing uncontrollably around 2 a.m. So I get out of bed to see what's going on and find my son sitting in the middle of the living room in complete darkness, laughing. I say, "Hey buddy, what are you doing?" in toddler speak. He says, "Papa funny." I got a little nervous for some reason and went to pick him up to bring him to our room for the rest of the night. As I'm hauling him away, he says, "Bye, Papa," and blows a kiss at absolutely nothing I can see. I grew up spending summers at my grandfather's farm in northern Pennsylvania. Days where the heat danced in lines above the rolling hills, and nights that left soil cool to the touch. Rows of cornstalk whispering in the wind like soldiers marching across the fields. The Scarecrow, in his sun-bleached red flannel shirt and his dusty blue overalls, stayed stiff in the wind. I was 8 years old. My baggy brown t-shirt rippled on my body like curtains as I watched the rolling clouds turn gray. "Alice, get your ass in here before the storm gobbles you up," I heard my grandfather say. I looked back at him and then back out towards the clouds and slowly dancing sea of stalks. The wind had blown the straw hat from the Scarecrow's head. I walked to it, the wind blowing back my hair as the straw hat rolled towards my feet. I picked it up and approached the stiff man of straw, who bent forward and snatched it from my hands, placing it on his glaring potato sack head. He resumed his position, standing rigid against the wind, immobile.